Hello everybody, my name is Jim Pingle, and this month we'll be talking about server load balancing on 2.4. This is our July 2017 Hangout. All right, first up we have project notes. We'll be talking about pfSense 2.3.4 release patch 1. That came out very recently. It's a security and errata release with an important update for OpenVPN. If you haven't already updated to that or updated OpenVPN manually like we mentioned last month, you need to get that updated immediately. There's a very important set of vulnerabilities that were found in OpenVPN that need to get the servers and clients all updated as soon as you can. There's a blog post about the release. If you follow the link there, you can find out about it. Very similarly, the same fuzzer who found the vulnerabilities in OpenVPN also targeted FreeRadius, and he found some issues. And our FreeRadius 2 package is end of life. It's not getting updates anymore. And that does have the security problems that were found. So we also have a FreeRadius 3 package available. So if you just uninstall the FreeRadius 2 package, install FreeRadius 3, all your settings will carry over, has all the same features and then some. It's a much newer version. It's all fully up to date, has all the patches. It's ready to go. So there wasn't a way to automatically push people from one to the other yet, but we're working on that. Our 2.4 release is progressing. We're still looking over the remaining tickets. There's only a couple things blocking us from putting out a release candidate yet. We have some release highlights up on the blog. If you go over that. The high points are, we've gone over that before in previous Hangouts, but there's FreeBSD 11, there's a new installer, we got ZFS, OpenVPN 2.4. We're taking out NanoBSD and i386, but we're adding an ARM support for our SG1000 device, and soon we'll have our SG3000 or 3100 device as well, formerly known as R1, and by a couple other internal names. But we've been tweeting about that quite a bit. It's coming very soon. The release candidate's coming very soon, and we'll have 2.4 coming out in the very near future. We have our NRDM, our central management system demo that we're working on. The demonstration of that's going to be happening during on-site training. We've got some training dates coming up in France, UK, Germany, and Russia. If you go to netgate.com/training, you can find out about that. Pretty soon, we're also going to have posted up our advanced class of pfSense Supplementals 1. It's going to have higher level topics such as snort, radius, DNSBL, and a little bit deeper look at HAProxy than we're doing today. So about this Hangout, we've got server load balancing that we're going to be doing. I'm going to very briefly show you RelayD, but I'm going to kind of skim over that because it hasn't changed much. And I'm going to primarily focus on HAProxy. HAProxy is more capable and reliable. RelayD really hasn't changed in years, so you can look at the old Hangout stuff on the wiki, in the book, wherever. It's all very basic stuff, same as it's always been. So we had a previous Hangout on that back in January 2015. If you need to look that over, you can look back in the archive. Go over the advantages and disadvantages of them. Going to assume you've already got web servers in place and your DNS server entries and everything ready to go. Just need to do the firewall portion of it. I'm also going to go over how to do SSL offloading in HAProxy, just the basics of it, how you could work the ACME package in there for Let's Encrypt certificate automation and integration with HAProxy and for SSL offloading. And we'll go over a bit about how to use HAProxy ACLs to redirect requests by hostname. So kind of how you use those ACLs and what some cool things you can do with them. Okay, well, first up, RelayD and HAProxy. What are they, and how the basics of how they work. RelayD is built into the pfSense software base installation. It's originally from OpenBSD, and it's meant to work with PF directly. It's a very basic, simple service. It does specific tasks, basically just forwards a TCP connection in, redirects it on through. It tracks the servers behind and makes sure, that it's only sending requests to a server that's actually up, and it can do round robin type stuff, which I'll get to. HAProxy is not in the base system. It's an add-on package, but it's easy to install with a couple of clicks. It's very powerful, a lot more flexible. It's actually a true proxy, not just a relay. It has more capabilities, but it does use more resources, though the trade-off is more than worth it. So and how they operate. RelayD works using NAT and port forward or NPF, so kind of like a super port forward or a smart port forward. The RelayD daemon monitors the servers, and it makes sure that there's NAT rules in PF that will do what you need to do to get the traffic back through. But it just interfaces with PF. It doesn't actually accept connections. HAProxy is a true proxy. It accepts the client connections, and the client talks to HAProxy. HAProxy does what it needs to do, and then it will forward that request on, or actually makes its own request back to the servers behind. So clients talk to HAProxy. HAProxy talks to the server. Server talks to HAProxy. HAProxy talks back to the client. Whereas with RelayD, it just sets up the NAT, and the client talks directly to the server. Server talks directly back to the client, and RelayD is only setting up NAT and states and such so that it will happen all in PF. As such, RelayD can't look at the contents of the packets. It only forwards based on the packet headers because that's all PF sees. Now, but HAProxy, because it's a true proxy, it can look inside that request and act on the headers. So it accepts that connection from the client makes its request to HAProxy. HAProxy sees what the client is going for, and then it will forward that on to the server, and it can act on the headers and what it needs to do. HAProxy, for example, it can route requests to specific servers based on a host name. It can do that for SSL sites using SNI. But obviously you can't see as deep into SSL connections as you can into HTTP. So both RelayD and HAProxy, they can handle arbitrary TCP services. So you can use them for HTTP, HTTPS, mail, pretty much anything you need to do that's a TCP service out there. Now, whether or not you'd want to, it's entirely up to you. Normally, if you've got one server that's overloaded, it can help you spread the load out and spread that across multiple servers, so you're not so overloaded. So the features in HAProxy are geared toward HTTP and HTTPS, but it can work with other protocols as long as you're just a simple TCP service if you want. It can just do more with the HTTP and HTTPS. So how RelayD and HAProxy handle client addresses here. RelayD, because it only uses NAT, when the connection passes through, the server sees the true client address that's coming through. So the server is talking directly to the client talking to the server. It will flow through and show up there. So the server, like in its logs, in its environment, whatever, in the web server process, when it sees this request, it has the real IP address of the client there, always. But HAProxy, because it's a proxy, the web server by default is going to see the address of the proxy there. So it can't necessarily differentiate where this client's coming from. It can't determine that. However, HAProxy, at least with HTTP, can add the X forwarded for header, which can be used by the web server. Now, Apache, Nginx, others, that you can log that X forwarded for instead of the proxy address. You could set up a custom log format where you log it in addition to that address. Your web applications will be able to get that X forwarded for in the headers. And I think if there's more than one proxy involved, they all add on to it. So you may need to set up some logic so you can find out like the real client address, whichever one. I think it's like the leftmost address in the list. So the earliest entry in a comma separated list kind of thing. But that's all something that would be up to a web application to understand. HAProxy does have a transparent client IP setting, which it works using IPFW. You can kind of pass that through. It's a little bit more complicated, has a little bit more overhead involved. Not usually necessary, but if you have an application that just won't budge, can't do X forwarded for, you can activate that and kind of and get by. Now for reporting, RelayD only supports up-down status and some uptime percentages and some very, very basic front-end stats, nothing fancy. HAProxy will give you probably more than you ever wanted to know in terms of statistics about usage and distribution of traffic and requests. So world's different. Now HAProxy will give you a lot more detail that you might need to evaluate your server load. Reliability, for more than basic or simple tasks, RelayD is going to fall apart. Especially high loads, it's just going to fall over. Has a lot of trouble, especially with a lot of rapid requests or a large number of requests. We push everybody toward HAProxy these days with anything significant because it's just going to handle that better. HAProxy is a lot more robust and reliable. It's going to use more resources, but it's going to be worth that trade-off for the extra stability and reliability. So the daemons themselves, how they work. RelayD, since it works using NAT, it doesn't have to bind to anything. It doesn't necessarily need a virtual IP. If the traffic is routed to the firewall, it might need a virtual IP just so that it can, answer a request upstream and say, okay, this traffic's on the firewall, send it to me. But if it's for a routed block or an address that's already on the firewall, nothing special. It'll just come right through, just like you were doing a port forward or one-to-one NAT. Now, HAProxy, on the other hand, because it's a true daemon, it's going to be binding to these addresses and ports that you need specifically. So if you need it to bind to your WAN address on the same ports used by the GUI or the GUI redirect that are there by default, you may have to, make some adjustments, which we'll talk about on how to get around that. If you need a virtual IP address, it's going to have to be an IP alias or a CARP type virtual IP address because it has to be able to bind to it. Now, balancing methods. Here's another part where RelayD just can't cut the mustard. All it can do is round robin style load balancing, and that usually isn't enough, especially when you get into complicated web applications that may need a bit more intelligence there. Now with HAProxy, there are several choices you have, and they're all explained in the GUI. I'm not going to go over all of them today, but mostly it can do round robin just like RelayD. It can do a static round robin. It can do least connections, so it will try to push connections toward whichever server isn't as fully loaded in terms of of maintaining connections. It can do a source hash where it tries to do that. It can even work on the URL. Splicing up part of the URL and deciding where to hash based on that. So a lot more options, and especially if your web application on your server has tends to hold open connections pretty long with clients. If you have clients that are on there for a long amount of time, the least connections method is probably going to be a lot more effective for you than the round robin because it's going to be pushing more traffic toward whichever server is handling the least amount of clients at a time. So, if they're equal, it'll end up, sort of being round robin because it'll add one, then that'll be more, and then it'll add another one, and so on and so forth. Now, the client-server relationships, and in this case, I'm talking about sessions. Like, say you have a login session where a user logs in, and they need to maintain a session like a shopping cart type thing, or maybe it's they're logging in, looking at something on a personal profile or whatever. With RelayD, you don't really have much choice of trying to keep the same client always going to the same server. It has an option called sticky connections, but that has issues maintaining client-server relationships even in the best of days. It tries to make sure there's a relationship, but depending on the timing, you can kind of tweak the timing a little bit, but it might expire or it has to keep this massive table open, and it's not ideal. However, HAProxy has several different methods that it can use. The source hash is one way. There's also other tricks it can do with stick tables and things. It can track by cookie values, especially like a PHP or a JSession ID, that kind of thing. Where so if a user is sending a cookie value, and it will always route a specific cookie value back to a specific server. So really, a lot more intelligence there, and a lot more options, flexibility and reliability there. Now for SSL offloading, RelayD being just a relay, it can't do that. It just passes connections through, the connections don't terminate. But HAProxy can do SSL offloading, where all of the SSL TLS certificate, processing and the encryption, decryption, all that can happen on your firewall at the HAProxy step if you want to. All right, just a little bit of a setup before we get to the how-to parts here. In my demo environment that I've got set up, I've got one firewall, just one firewall acting as a load balancer. There's multiple web servers behind it, which in my case is really just one server with a bunch of different IP addresses and different hosts on different, bound to different IP addresses all in there because it was a little easier for me. But for all intents and purposes, it's multiple separate web servers. I've got DNS entries set so that multiple host names like www.example.com and example.com and blog.example.com all resolve to virtual IP addresses on, or a virtual IP address on the WAN of that firewall. And I've got a couple of other test hosts, which I'll talk about. And I've just got the test client on WAN, which in this case is just this PC we're doing the hangout on. Now the virtual server for Relay D, I'm going to have that on port 8080 so it can be separate. I've got HAProxy on 80 and 443. I just wanted to have them both be run at the same time. You can run Relay D on port 80 if you want. I just wanted, I could have done that on a separate, separate virtual address with a different host name, but a little bit more complicated setup that way. And I wanted to try and keep things a little simpler. Now, I am going to kind of skim through the Relay D stuff because it has not changed, like I mentioned. There is a full walkthrough on the wiki. There is the previous Hangout. There is also the book. Lots of resources on that. Very simple, not much to it. And I'll show you how it looks in the GUI, but I'm not going to go over every single field. So before you set up any servers in Relay D, you need to configure the monitors. The stock monitors are probably fine. For HTTP, you could give it a specific URI if you wanted to. You need to make sure all your servers are online and operational. All right, so let's break out into the actual Relay D setup here. So here under Services and Load Balancer is where I'm at. First thing you do is set up a pool. And you can just click plus to add a pool. Oh, sorry, I guess I got logged out here. And the pool entry, you just give it a name, tell it load balance, tell it what port the actual servers behind are listening on. So this is your actual web server ports on your web servers in the back end, not the public port. This is the private port. Select your monitor and you just punch in your IP address for a server, add to pool. Punch in the IP address for the server, add to pool. You see that I've done that twice here for 8 and 9. Save that. You'll go back up here to the load balancer pools and you'll see them in the list. After you've got your pools set up, you just do a virtual server. And you can see I've already got it here. Just give it a name, very short, different name from the pool. Now this is the public address on the WAN side where the connections are going to be coming into, and this is the public port. Like I said, I've got this one going on 8080. Then pick your virtual server pool. You don't need a fallback pool, but you can set up a separate pool for like a maintenance page or something like that if you want to. If all of the servers in the virtual server pool are down, it will switch over and use the fallback pool. And then your relay protocol is TCP, and then save. And that's really it. There's not much more to it than that. You can go over here to the settings tab and kind of tweak these settings a little bit. The timeout defaults to 1 second, the interval defaults to 10 seconds, and there's a default of 5 retries. And those between all of those, it's going to be about a minute before it notices the server is down, so you might want to reduce this. Especially the interval, you may want to cut it down to like 1 or 2 seconds, maybe two seconds with a 1 second timeout, or 1 second with like a half-second timeout, something along those lines. Make it fail over a little bit faster. Now, once you've got all this set up, you do need to add firewall rules. And the important part here to know is you want to pass the traffic, because this works like a port forward with Relay D. You pass the traffic into your private addresses. You need to put like all your servers in the pool in an alias and pass to that. So this is your private or local backend servers, all of them in an alias or separate rules, but an alias is much simpler. And then you pass to whatever the inside port is. And I've got a bunch of ports on an alias here. Really, in this case, it was just port 80. So it could have just been port 80 there. And that's it. Come over here, you'll see I'm tied into server 2. But that's just with this browser session. But if I go over here to like curl you'll see server 1, server 2, server 1, server 2, server 1, server 2. So it's just doing round robin, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. A couple little other notes about RelayD. If you have a client on the LAN and your servers are on the LAN, then the clients can't reach the servers because of the way NAT happens. You will have to add your own manual outbound NAT rules on the LAN to work around that. There's a sample rule here. I go over that in more detail, I think, in the previous Hangout. There's also, I'm pretty sure it's on the wiki and in the book too. Just have to set up some outbound NAT to handle that. You can go to status and load balancer. It'll show you the status of the pool servers and their uptime percentage. And over here on virtual servers, it gives you, shows the screen because I got 2 servers up. And then if it gives you some very basic stats about the front end. Now, if you do want to test this in a browser and not using a command like something like curl, you would have to actually close and open new browser sessions, or maybe launch an incognito window, load it, see what it does, close that, launch a new incognito window, and test it over and over, because it will have to make a whole new connection. The only good way to force that is by using a new browser session or using something like curl that, it just makes a request and closes. It doesn't hold anything open like a browser does. So don't get discouraged if you open up a browser and refresh and you're not seeing a bunch of different stuff. Like, well, so there, it finally switched me over to server 1. But, that's just going to be, how the browser handled your connection. All right, so let's switch gears and go over to HAProxy now. First things first, in HAProxy, if you want to use port 80, by default, the firewall is going to grab onto port 80 and use it for the GUI redirect. And that's this option here, Web GUI redirect. I've already got it disabled with a check mark because I've got HAProxy already set up on this box, and I'm using it for port 80. Alternately, you could leave that redirect on, and you could set up a port forward on the WAN to send external connections coming into port 80 to some other port on localhost where you have HAProxy listening. That's up to you. I'm doing that style with HTTPS because I didn't want to move the GUI on here. I wanted to keep 443 for the GUI from, on the main address, but then on that VIP, I wanted to use 443 for HAProxy. So I'll show you how that works too. We'll get there. Okay, so if you want to use port 80, kill the redirect. If you want to use port 443 for HAProxy directly, you can change the port of your GUI here if you want to. Just enter a new port like 4433 or 444, something, as long as it's not 443, and as long as it's a port that's not already in use for something else. And after you do that, hit save, and then that'll be okay. If you don't already have it installed, you can just go to System and Package Manager. Over on the Available Packages tab, find HAProxy in the list and install it. I've already got it installed, so you'll see it here. And then once you have it installed, it's available here under Services and HAProxy. So the first thing we need to do, similar to with RelayD, we added the pool first, and HAProxy you add the backend first, which is like a pool. So you go in here. I've already got a bunch of these set up. I'm going to show you what a new one looks like. I'm not going to actually save it though. So you come in here and you would have it say, give it a name like LB Group or my web servers or whatever, and then you add an entry here for each server in the backend. Each one uses a unique name, and this is just an internal name. It could be server 1, LB1, whatever. Doesn't have to correspond to anything at the moment. You could make it a host name. Usually you'd want to make it the host name of whatever's behind there for your own reference. Now your forward to is just going to be address and port, and like in this case, I'm just going to use the internal address in port 80. So let me go ahead and just fill this in. Then add another entry, LB2. Port 80. And you can leave the other settings. This kind of scrolls here. Just watch out for that, depending on how wide your browser window is. We're not using SSL on these backends, and so like the communication from HAProxy to these backends will not have SSL encryption, and we don't need to put a wait on there. You could put a wait on there. Say you've got 3 servers on the backend, and one of them is just twice as fast as the others. You could, give the two lower ones a weight of 10 and the bigger one a weight of 20, that kind of thing. That can kind of let you fine tune your round robin percentages there. So you've got, that would be for like static round robin according to the weights, and a round robin according to the weights. I'm just going to default to doing round robin just because it's the quickest and easiest. Static is similar to round robin, but if you change the weights while HAProxy is still running, it's not going to adjust things like round robin would. Least connections, like I mentioned, it's for making sure that whichever one is the lightest, has the lighter load in terms of total connections, it'll do that. Now it can't see CPU usage or percentage, so if you have a very heavy user, it may skew things, but in general, it's a good guess for like I said, like longer lived session type things. Source does a source hash, which is pretty good, and it also buys you, the relationship between client and server being maintained. And there's also URI, which I mentioned earlier, where you can split it up based on part of the URL, either before the question mark or the whole URI, depending on how you do that. All right, so most of this other stuff you can really just leave at defaults. The health check method, I've left it at HTTP. You can set it to basic to just do a basic TCP connection test. HTTP will actually try to make an HTTP request, and these options control what kind of request it is. You could have it do like a head or a get request for a specific URI to make sure it's up. Usually you'd want to make that some static content like a static image, so it's not something dynamic. Because if you do something dynamic, it could actually overload your dynamic process. This is a check that's going to happen once a second, by default anyway. So you can tweak this a bit. There's the transparent client IP option I mentioned. If you want it, it's up to you if you want it or not. There's cookie-based persistence on HTTP if you want to do that. Stick tables here, like I mentioned, you can do an existing cookie value. You could also stick on the source address or session ID, but the cookie value, I've got this set, like a default set of settings over here that are good, but there's also, it mentions some things here that are all right too. There's a JSession ID like for JSP, PHP for PHP. There's ASP.NET session ID, that kind of stuff. So you can fill that stuff in if you want, if you need cookie-based persistence, which is very handy if you need to make sure that your clients match up to the servers that they use throughout the entire duration of their session. So nothing else in here you really need to worry about. You might do HSTS if you're going to do SSL offloading, but I wouldn't worry about that until later. All right, so you save that, and then you'll get back to the backend list, and then we'll come over here and do the front end. Now on the front end, I give it a name like my website or LB or something like that. I've got things set up a little fancier that'll show you as we work up to it, but I'm just going to do this just show you what it looks like. Got a description, external address. Now this is the public address where it is going to be binding and listening for connections. This could be your WAN address, it could be a VIP, like I've got this VIP here, and then I'm on that, but yeah, that VIP on port 80. I'm not doing SSL on this front end, it's just going to be for HTTP, so I leave that unchecked. Type is HTTP. Not going to need any access control lists. Set the default backend to my LB group, or it was like what, my web servers, I think I had it in the other example. You can change logging if you want. There's error stuff. I like to check forward to use X forwarded for, and then I set this down here to HTTP close to kind of disable the keep alive stuff, which make sure that X forwarded for is accurate throughout the entire session. And then that should be it, really. That's the basics of what you need there. Save that and come over here to the settings tab. Now I've got this enabled. I've got 1,000 connections on here, and it's using about 32 mega RAM. You can see there's a table here with an estimate for plain HTTP SSL offloading uses a little more. So you can use that as a rough guide. And this is just how many maximum connections will be coming through concurrently. So depending on your load, you may have to tune that. Number of processes to start. You should really leave this as blank or 1. Putting it higher will help it spread the load across multiple cores, but it can make ACL processing not work as you expect. There might be some other downsides to that as well. I don't remember off the top of my head, but if you aren't using ACL, say you've just got one front end and some back end servers and nothing real fancy, and you just need to spread the load across all your cores, you could up that as you need. Reload behavior, that's up to you if you want to do that or not. If you check this box, it will actually close all the connections and restart. HAProxy can give it a full reload. If it's unchecked, it's just going to do a simple reload where it just refreshes the settings without kicking the old clients off. Internal stats port, I turn that on port 2200, which is where I think that's where the GUI expects it to be. You can set up logging if you want to a remote syslog server. There are, let's see, global DNS resolvers. You don't really need that, but sometimes if you're using host names in places, you might want to do that. Usually it'll use the system resolvers, but if you do this, it can actually set up specific DNS servers just to be used by HAProxy. It could be an internal DNS server that gives it different responses than the public might see. There's more email notification options if you want to set that up. DH size, if you're going to do SSL offloading, I would set this to 2048 at least. Maybe even up to 4096, depending on how your CPU load is. I think it defaults to 1024, which is okay, but 2048 or better is the best practice at the moment. You can check this box if you've got an HA cluster if you want, and that just like a pfSense XML RPC config sync cluster type setup. That'll push that over, and save that. Once you've got that saved, and then you'll have to apply the changes. You can come over here to the stats tab and make sure that it's up and running. And it'll give you a readout, shows you all sorts of fun stuff of what's going on. You can get all sorts of stats and information out of it. Status on your backend servers, how many requests and what type of requests are going to these backend servers, the response codes that have come back. It's really just a crazy amount of stats you can get out of here. And you could even use these stats to identify a problem with the server that hasn't been flagged yet based on like the response codes. If you're getting back like 500 error codes, from a server, you might know to investigate that for problems. And up here in the front end stats, this is just, what things are coming through for clients and what they're seeing and responses they're seeing. And it's really, really detailed, cool stuff. So got all that going here. Now you will need to add firewall rules, like I mentioned. Now I also did a NAT rule, and I'm going to show you that for a second here too. You could use the same tactic with HTTP if you want. I just did a port forward on my VIP for destination 443, redirecting it to localhost on 4433. So when it came time to do my HAProxy front end for that, I put it on localhost port 4433. Now that automatically entered a firewall rule. Over here on the rules tab, we'll see that right here, the NAT redirect with going to localhost on 4433. Now this is just a plain HTTP front end that's actually on port 80 on that IP in HAProxy, so it is bound right there, and in the firewall rule lets the traffic right to that. Now the important thing is with HAProxy, if you're bound right to an IP address and port, that's where the rule goes. Nothing fancy, don't have to worry about NAT considerations, anything like that. HAProxy is bound to an IP and port. That's where the firewall rule has to pass to. Very straightforward. So now let's aim a web browser over here at lb.example.com, and you'll see here this is a lot easier to see. It's because I didn't set up any kind of persistence. It's actually load balancing every time I refresh. I get a different server. Same if I come over here and do curl, server 2, server 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. So every time is giving me a different backend server, which is what I wanted in this case. If that's not what you want, you can set up one of the several persistence options that you have available. And similar to Relay D when you're testing, again, depending on how you have it set, you may need to close a browser, reopen a browser before you'll get a connection to a separate server. All right, so let's move on a little bit and do SSL offloading. When you do SSL offloading, that means that HAProxy on the firewall is going to handle all of the SSL TLS negotiation, encryption, and decryption between clients and the proxy. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that is going to put a lot higher CPU burden on the firewall. So it's going to increase your load on the firewall dramatically. So if you've got a big beefy box, sure, go ahead. But if you've got a shrinky-dink little thing with a weak CPU, it's going to keel it over. So it's not something you want to turn on unless you know you have the resources to put behind it. If your CPU has AES-NI, OpenSSL can help you out there with offloading some of the crypto. Now, because it shifts the burden of that over to the firewall, it's going to decrease the burden on the web servers if you're using HTTP on the back end. So by default, what tends to happen is, you've got this encryption with SSL, it's offloaded from your web servers, the clients are talking to your firewall, it's doing SSL there. So your client communication to HAProxy is encrypted. Now from HAProxy back to your backend servers, that's a different story. That could be HTTP, in which case they would just be plain web servers on HTTP. They don't have to worry about certificates or anything like that. However, that does mean that any data in that connection is not encrypted between HAProxy and your web servers. So depending on the security of that network, it may or may not be a huge concern. The best practice, if you're carrying any kind of sensitive data, financial data, medical data, is to still encrypt it. Never let it on a network unencrypted. However, depending on your local regulations, policies, whatever, that may be okay as long as it is a properly isolated segment of a network to where it's at. But again, make sure before you assume you can do HTTP with that kind of stuff, even on a back end, make sure security-wise you're covered. Personally, if it was sensitive enough, I would still do that just to be on the safe side. It'd still be load balanced so it's still a lesser burden on each individual server. The load on the firewall would be a lot heavier in that case, but depending on the data you're carrying, you may not have any other good choice. So if you want to do SSL offloading, the first thing you need to do is import your CA and certificates into the firewall. So you just go under System Insert Manager, and on the CAs tab here, you want to make sure you import any root certificate authorities and intermediates that are going to be involved. So import your root first, and then your intermediates. And once you've got that, then you come over here and do your certificate and import the server certificate over here. Now, if you're going to use Let's Encrypt or ACME, all that'll be handled for you automatically by the package. We'll get to how to do that in a second. I've already done that on here. So let's go on and just assume you've got your certificate in there. We'll go here into HAProxy and look at what this one looks like here. So this is just my Hangout demo site. I've got it called Hangout SSL. I've got it bound to localhost because remember I used that NAT role, and I'm on port 4433, and I've got that NAT role that's taken that, the external 443 and putting it there. I did check SSL offloading over here, and that is going to activate an SSL offloading section of this page lower down. I've got it set for HTTP, HTTPS offloading. Anything else is just typical, whatever you want to do, default backend. I've got it set to the Hangout, which is where it needs to go. Blah, blah, blah. Don't have to worry. I'm not worrying about any of that. Don't need to worry about any of this stuff. I did use X-forwarded for and HTTP close like before. And my SSL offloading section here For my certificate, I've got my web server certificate selected, or I call it hangout cert. I've got this box checked here to add an ACL for the subject alternative name, so it's going to match based on any host name that's in that certificate. And then you can put in additional certificates if you need to, but don't need to worry about anything in this section down here because that's all for client certificates. And that's it. Save, and you're done. Now on your backend setting, again, just like before, most of the time you're going to have if you're doing HTTP on the backend, you'll have a backend here like this is shared between two different front ends, one for HTTP, one for HTTPS. So the only difference thing here is if you wanted to encrypt on the backend, you could just check SSL here. You get some more options. Basically, if you want to verify the certificate and do some additional verification here, cookie persistence and whatnot. So you have all these other options if you want it, but you don't necessarily need them. I just have the same backend defined here, and I'm using it for HTTP and also for HTTPS. But it's entirely up to you how you want to run that backend. Now I've got, it's here, it's already running. I've got this over here, and it's up and running. It's hitting there. You can see I'm getting the certificate from Let's Encrypt, and everything is kosher. I've got a green padlock. So, and it's really very simple. You just need to make sure you've got your whole certificate chain, and then you set up a front end for the SSL, and that's it. I mean, it's super easy. So let's look at ACME integration. Let's Encrypt is a service that lets you obtain free domain validated SSL certificates. So really, as long as you can stand up a web server on a domain you own, you could get a free certificate for it. We went over this in great detail in the April 2017 Hangout. It was all about Let's Encrypt. So if you are not familiar with Let's Encrypt or the ACME protocol in general, you can go back and watch that Hangout. There's tons of good info there, how you might use those. But basically, the ACME package on pfSense is going to handle all of the nuts and bolts of getting you a certificate. You just need to set up a little bit on the server side to begin with. So in terms of using ACME with HAProxy, a couple different ways you can do it. You could use it independently. Like if you use a DNS method in the ACME package, that isn't going to need any special handling from HAProxy. None at all. For HTTP, there's a few different ways you can do it. I'm going to show a method using a Lua script, which is basically a little Lua server a little Lua script that will run as a service in HAProxy. You could also have it, the ACME package could like SFTP some files back to one of your backend web servers, and you could, direct a request to use just that backend if it came in from ACME, or there's a bunch of different ways you could solve it. But I like the Lua script method because it keeps things self-contained and it doesn't require moving anything off the firewall. It doesn't require any special handling on any of your backend servers. They don't even have to know. So the first thing you do to use this Lua script is you come over here to Files, and you'll add an entry in the list, which I've already got here. Let me see if I can edit that here. I called it acme-http01, and I've got the type set to Lua script, and then I pasted in this Lua script. I'm going to try to get the source for this script posted with the Hangout, but you can also get it from this link here. And it is also posted on the forum in one of the Let's Encrypt threads. If you type in like Let's Encrypt, HAProxy, pfSense, you'll probably find it. So you come over here, you paste the contents of that script in this box, and it's not a very large script. Then save, and that'll be loaded into HAProxy. So on your front end, all you need to do is set up an ACL to do this. And we're going to talk a little bit more about ACLs and what all these other things mean, but I want to focus just on HAProxy, or on ACME first. So we're coming down here, and we've got URL ACME HTTP 01. Path starts with, and then this path here. This is the path where the ACME package will drop the file, where the Let's Encrypt servers will request the files, rather. So when a request comes in, if it's for this directory, it's going to trigger this ACL. And there's nothing else extra with that, it's just that. So URL underscore ACME underscore HTTP 01, path starts with, and then this whole path, which is also over here in the slides you'll be able to get. Come down here a little further, and we can set up the action that happens when that ACL gets triggered. So we come down here, and let's see, yeah, okay. So we come down here, and here is this one. We have HTTP request Lua service, which is the action. So that's going to start our Lua script, or connect back to our Lua server script. The condition is the same condition name we put in up in the ACL just a moment ago, which is URL underscore ACME underscore HTTP 01. And then our function, now this is the name of the script we put in on the Files tab. I called it ACME-HTTP 01 there. And that's really all you got to put in into HAProxy. So save and apply that in HAProxy. And then if you don't have the ACME package installed, you can install the ACME package. Again, for details on that, look on the wiki, go to the old Hangout, whatever. Now you just make a new, you'll make an account key first onto the Let's Encrypt production, and then you'll come over here and set up a certificate. Now the only difference here is you'll tell it the domain name that you've got. And now this is the domain name. You've already got it set up in DNS that resolves back to your firewall and it's feeding into HAProxy. And your method is webroot local folder. And then here it's /tmp/HAProxy underscore chroot / and then the .well-known /acme challenge directory. And again, that's all in the slides too if you need to refer back to it. You can also set up an action here. It's in the examples right here for restarting HAProxy. And so that will, after the certificate gets renewed, it will restart HAProxy to pick up the new certificate. Save that. And then come back here and you'll click the Issue Renew button. Now what happens then, the ACME package will make a request to Let's Encrypt. Let's Encrypt will make the request back to verify. It'll hit HAProxy, hit that Lua service, pick up the files from the ACME package, verify everything, come back the other way, and issue your certificate, which will then get dropped into the certificate manager and then get picked up by HAProxy. So a lot of automation there, and you will want to, over here on the General Settings tab, set up the cron job to renew them automatically. It will, once a day, go out and say, well, is it time to renew this certificate? If it is, it'll renew it. If it gets renewed, it'll restart HAProxy. So once you get that set and make sure it's automated, you don't have to really think about it a whole lot from there on. And like I mentioned, it'll drop that in the cert manager. You'll see the Let's Encrypt certificate authority here, and then your certificates tab, you'll have your actual certificate showing Let's Encrypt as the issuer. And then when you go into HAProxy, it's just going to be in your list of certificates to pick for your SSL offloading for servers. It'll just be here in the list. And that's all there is to that. That's pretty straightforward if you're familiar with the Let's Encrypt package. If you're not familiar with Let's Encrypt, like I said, using this webroot method is one of the easiest things you can do. I mean, it's by far easier than setting up all the DNS methods I was mentioning in the ACME package Hangout a couple months ago, but it's still a good idea to go through the Hangout if you're not familiar. So, we used an ACL there for for handling the hangout front end, or the ACME front end. But there's a lot more you can do with ACLs. You can use them to take actions basically off any condition that you can set up here. Sorry. The most common request for ACME or for HAProxy ACLs is redirecting based on host name. Now that is something you're only going to be able to do for HTTP and HTTPS, because something like SMTP, it's not, or SSH or whatever, it's not going to send a host name with that initial request in a way that HAProxy can see and act on, where HTTP does. So, say you've got one public IP address, but you've got 3 internal web servers that you can't consolidate and use vhosts. You need to have 3 separate internal servers, and you need to be able to reach them all from the outside on your one address. Well, HAProxy can do that for you. So you match that specific host name coming in, and then as the action, you can direct it to a different backend. Very simple. It might be a little tricky to get the first 1 or 2 going, but once you've seen it, it's super easy. So you can also match specific paths and direct to different backends or take actions. You can match a specific source address. You can add headers. You can deny access. You can rewrite them to a different URL. All kinds of fancy stuff you can do with these requests. So access lists, like I mentioned with the ACME stuff, you set up a condition and then you act on that condition. But we can't do this yet. You see them here in the list, but what we need to do first is go to your backends. You need to make sure you've got a backend defined for every individual server you've got. Okay, so here I've got a backend for a blog site. I've got a backend for my example.com domain. I've got a backend for the Hangout stuff I already showed you, and a backend for the load balancing group. And all of those want to be HTTP. They all want to be on the same external IP address. So how am I going to pull that off? Well, they all have different host names. DNS is already set up. So all I need to do is set up all of these matches so it'll do what I want. So I set up a condition, and I just named these something that's easy to remember for me. I've got a condition here with example site, host matches, example.com. And then another one also with example site, which will trigger it to do an OR condition. If there's 2 with the same name, it'll do an OR condition. So host matches www.example.com. So the 2 of these entries together, these 2 entries here together, mean if the request comes in and it's either example.com or www.example.com, that triggers the example site ACL. And then below that, I've got a blog site condition matching blog.example.com. I've got LB site condition matching lb.example.com, and hangout site matching hangout, .gmp.pw there. So how am I acting on these? It's all different backend functions. So we have action, use backend, condition, example site, backend, example.com. So basically, if it's example.com or www.example.com, send that to the example.com backend. If it matches the blog site condition, send that to the blog backend. Send it to the LB site backend. If it matches LB site, LB group backend. Matches hangout site, hangout backend. And you can set a default backend, for whatever you want to come up. If the host name in the request cannot be determined, that's where it's going to send them. And whichever one that is, completely up to you. But that's going to be what your fallback is if the client does not send a host header, like if they access it by IP address, or if they request a host name that resolves there, but you don't have an ACL set up to match it, that's where they're going to go. So normally that would just be like your main web server or something, or maybe a server with a bunch of vhosts on it that you don't want to have to set up conditions for. All the other options are already set, forward for and HTTP close. I could do the usual stuff I was telling you before with stick tables and cookie persistence, whatever, it's all up to you. So I have all those conditions set. And you can see here, I've got example.com, comes up example.com, same with www.example.com, blog.example.com goes to the blog. LB is still over there happily load balancing, and my hangout is on HTTPS, but if I do HTTP, it still is all coming there. And that's all running through the same front end in HAProxy. Now, HAProxy, the HAProxy package, has a function called shared front ends where you could set up a bunch of different front ends and they each have individual ACLs, but they're all on the same IP address and port, but they're marked shared front ends. And that has the exact same effect as what I just showed you. Personally, I think it's easier to have everything under one front end and use a bunch of different conditions. But if logically, if you think it's easier for you to set that up as a shared front end, have at it, but it's a personal preference. All right, so as I showed you, right, one public IP address and the DNS example and how we set up the matches. So we've already been through all that. So that's all I had to show you today. So if you have any questions, I'm open to some questions here. Let's see, we just got provisioned IPv6 through our ISP, haven't tested it yet, but can we use IPv6 on our front end, still pass it to our IPv4 backend? I have not tried that personally, but I don't see why that wouldn't work, although it may lead to some weirdness if you try to use like X forwarded for, but it may all work out. I have not tried that, but I don't see why it wouldn't work because it's a proxy. If it wasn't a proxy, then no, that wouldn't work, but because it is a proxy, it's perfectly okay for the client to talk IPv6 to HAProxy, and then for HAProxy to talk IPv4 to the backend. I haven't tried it, but I don't see why that wouldn't work. It should work okay. Actually, I didn't have IPv6 set up on my on this server, or I'd try it right now. But yeah, it should work. All right, so any plan when pfSense will import new QAT driver for Intel Quick Assist? I don't know the plans on that, although I do know the driver that just came out for FreeBSD was very specific on which chipset it would support, and I think it was, I can't remember what it is. I don't want to misspeak, so I really can't say. But it was it'll be in the future, but I don't think it's going to be 2.4 release. If the entire internet breaks, blame me. Yeah. Wouldn't worry about the internet at large, but maybe your internal network. But no, at most, I would think a HAProxy just wouldn't forward to the back end. I don't think you got to worry about breaking the internet there. All right. Anybody else? Any questions? Any takers? I know I had a lot to go through, but I think I hit all the high points there. Now our advanced class that's coming up is going to have a little bit more detail and obviously the individual lab experience where you get to your hands-on, do it all yourself kind of stuff, and that'll be a lot better experience if you're looking to really get your hands into HAProxy and you don't want to just try it out yourself, on your own things. All right. Multiple SSL certs on a front. I don't have multiple SSL certs right now, but I will fake it real quick and just show you. If you're talking about like multiple different backends or multiple certificates for the same, that all go to the same backend, either way, it's all the same thing. You just additional certificate here and just pick another certificate. That's it. If you add the ACL here, it's going to automatically add an ACL for you that will match this front end and send it to whatever your default backend is. Or so really, it's up to you and how you want to match that. You can still do your same ACLs like I showed you, where in the other one where you match on the host name and direct it to a specific backend. That still works, but there's really not any much more to it. Yeah, and if you do that, it matches on SNI. I think it does SNI on that in that case. It still does SNI, and then it picks which certificate to use based on SNI. But there's some more about it right there in the GUI. It tells you how to do that, but it's all pretty straightforward stuff. There's really not much to worry about unless your client doesn't support SNI, and then it may fall apart. But but I think any modern client supports SNI. You may have to worry about. I think it says right there XP on IE with XP. Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about those. But yeah, Let's Encrypt is adding wildcards, so yeah, you might not have to worry about that for too long, assuming everything is under one domain. If you've got multiple domains, you may still have to worry about that unless they let you do multiple wildcards for multiple domains in a single certificate with the right validation. They might, but that'd be kind of crazy. But yeah, it's if you just let it do that, it's pretty straightforward. So yeah, I don't think they give you star.com, but you go right ahead and request it. All right, any other questions? Oh, another thing too with wildcards don't work on subdomains, so it'll work on every server under your domain. So like if I have something.example.com, it'd work for that. But if I have something.somethingelse.example.com, wildcards won't work for that unless you have a wildcard for star.something.example.com. So, or something else, whatever. So it'll help with some things, but not others. They learned that the hard way while trying to configure Cloudflare SSL Accelerator. Yeah, we've learned that the hard way too. And we used to have like files.atx and files.nyi and all these other trying to do certificates on all those with a wildcard. They got mashed into like ATX files and NYI files and some other things. So wildcards are good. You just got to know their limitations. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and call it there since nothing else coming in. So we will see you back here next month. And if you have any other questions or ideas for the Hangout topics or anything like that, you can post on the forum, post on Reddit, drop us a line one way or another, Twitter, wherever. And we'll see you back here next month. Thank you for attending.